Hey everybody, Rich here with Leaving MAGA at leavingmaga.org. This is an unexpected live stream that we are hosting for you today before our usual live stream. We have a very special edition live stream coming to you today. We are joined by Mr. Ami Fields-Meyer, who is one of the co-authors for a book here that, as you see it here, it's entitled On Courage, How to Be a Dissident in an Age of Fear, and his co-author is Miss Julia Angwin, and myself and one of our other leaders, Stefania Messina, and Leaving MAGA have the great privilege and honor of being mentioned in this book. I had a chance to meet Julia Ami last year at a conference. So first off, welcome to our Leaving MAGA live stream. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. So let me just start by taking a step back and talking about the book and how it came to be for a second. I think that will be good context for how we ended up in these conversations with people all over the world. I have worked in politics and policy as a government advisor and a political advisor for a long time. My co-author, Julia Angwin, is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. We met, actually, we were working on technology policy separately. She reported on it, I was working on it. And then when Trump won again, we both felt like our threat models for the world were off. The ways that we have been thinking about what it means to stay safe in a democracy, what it means to express oneself, what it means to do one's work, were fundamentally shifting. And so the question became, what do we do now? You know, when a leader shows a willingness, both a promise and then begins to actually wield that willingness to throw out all adherence to norms, constitutionality, etc., what do people who are used to operating within the bounds of a democracy do? We obviously cannot just rely on elections if the person and the people in charge are going to stop abiding, in many cases, or begin to try to hollow out the legitimacy of elections. We can't just rely on courts if we're going to be in a place where the courts are being stacked. We can't just rely on the media when the media is becoming a little bit less free every day and a little bit more consolidated every day. So the question is, as you ask, Rich, what are the tools? We talk to people all over the world, from Venezuela, from Russia, from Hungary, Nicaragua, several parts of Africa, Hong Kong, etc. And this is the question. It's people who have fought back in some way. And I will say that there are two basic answers here. One is political, and the second one is personal. So I'll say the political answer. When the tools of democracy, and there is a very interesting body of research that says, in backsliding democracies, in democracies that begin to backslide into something like authoritarianism or autocracy over the last 50, 75 years, of the places that had no civil resistance movement, 7% of those places were able to get their democracies back on track. Of the places that did have a civil resistance movement, that is strikes and boycotts and civil disobedience, throwing sand in the gears, what the political scientist Maurice Stefan calls collective stubbornness, not necessarily a kind of politics that most Americans are used to. Of the places that did that, 51% were able to get back on track. Still a jump ball, still a toss-up, but it's a game. The other answer is more interpersonal. And I think this has more to do with the work that you do in Leaving MAGA, the relational work that you do. And that is that the most successful dissidents in all these places are people who heard a voice of objection, much like you did, as we talked about in your story, that said, something is wrong here. There's something about this community that I'm part of. There's something about this country or this political movement or this regime that is no longer working for me. And what they did, as you did, I don't mean to speak for you, but just to,
It's okay.
to paraphrase, is eventually they followed that voice. But people followed that voice to wherever it took them. They generally did it by finding a community of others who shared their values. They were very serious about keeping themselves safe. They didn't take unnecessary risks for the sake of taking risks. And then, most critically, and we can talk more about this because it's so connected to your work, once they had established a sort of political home of others who shared their views, they employed all kinds of mechanisms to grow their movement. Those are the sort of the fundamental elements of the dissident work, the dissident arc that we discovered. But I think that those two things, the political strategy and the interpersonal strategy, have to be seen in tandem, but also understood as different parts of the same work.
And there was a point that stuck out to me in particular because I thought about it in my own life story, which is that dissidents don't choose to be dissidents. I'm curious about how some of the ones you interviewed, did they find themselves in that similar situation? Where it just happened organically and they became activists, dissidents, public figures.
We really weren't interested in people who were born to be political activists, because most of us aren't. Those people are interesting, but they were not our focus. And the reason they were not our focus is because most of us, I should say this, Rich, this book takes very seriously the real concerns that people have about speaking out. We don't poo-poo the risks that people feel. We don't minimize or diminish the very real, very serious, almost Darwinian instincts that many of us have to just stay in our lane and keep our head down because we don't want to lose someone we love, or a community, or or our status, or our wealth, or our safety, or our freedom. So the question is, the people who do speak out anyway, the people who do dissent anyway under extraordinary political circumstances, under repression, why? What is it that motivates them? There is a story that we tell in the book of a dissident, a Soviet dissident, a writer named Andrei Sinyavsky. Many of the leaders of the Soviet dissident movement, which, by the way, never grew to be much more than about 1,000 people at once. It was a lot of scientists and scholars and academics and writers. It was a lot of intellectuals. So this was a writer, this guy he wrote books and poems and plays, and that's just what his life was about. When Stalin introduced a series of laws that essentially made it illegal, punishable by gulag and often by death, to create what he called anti-Soviet art, art that contravened Soviet ideas, Soviet ideology. Sinyavsky writes that he's writing later, but he's reflecting that he had a choice before him. And the choice was either to live a life without art, without sort of an extension of his core values, or to live a life that was condemned, to be sort of a condemned man. And he said, ultimately, it wasn't that complicated. A life without art to him wasn't a life. So he kept writing, but they just kept going because that they were. And he says, to be a dissident is to consider yourself not guilty, right? It's the circumstances that cast you as a guilty person. But often, if you're in a country that has many of the Soviet dissidents, for example, all the Soviet dissidents were actually just advocating that the Soviet Constitution, which enshrined all these rights, just be adhered to. They were, but because of the social environment, they were conceived of as dissidents, as dissenters. So we really say to be a dissident is just to be who you are, right? And to be a dissident is not to consider yourself guilty. Other people can consider yourself guilty, but you just continue on. And we see this not just in history and not just with you, but with a mother in Venezuela who found that she wasn't able to feed her children anymore because of the economic crisis caused by the authoritarian state. And it is one of the things that binds dissidents together. I mean, when we were writing, neither of us was an expert in authoritarianism before this. This was as much a personal project of people who have a set of values, trying to figure out how to protect them under these circumstances. We reported this and wrote this as ICE was raiding cities, as student protesters were being rounded up, as the president was punishing political enemies. The initial piece that we wrote, that this book was based on, for The New Yorker, came out right around when Trump started sending those plane loads of Venezuelan immigrants to the CCOT facility in El Salvador. And I think for me, it just felt like the world is spinning out of control. I will say, Rich, I also have not been an activist in my life. I mean, I've worked in politics and I've worked in government, and I've been a writer, and I've certainly conversed sort of with ideas and policy, and I care about my country. But I have personally been an institutionalist. I still think that sort of at my core, I am an institutionalist. I worked inside City Hall. I worked at the White House. I don't like to rock the boat too much. I don't feel like a courageous person really at all, or, a dissident in any way. And one thing about going into a project like this without a thesis, I mean, I had ideas, but I didn't have I didn't really have a thesis, is that you can really just listen to people. And one thing that I came to understand about authoritarianism is that if democracy is like a wide open horizon, right? Democracy is all about the choices that we make, the choices that we exercise. It's the reason that we engage in politics by every 2 years showing up to cast our votes. If democracy is sort of an open horizon, authoritarianism is a narrowing, sort of constricting line of vision. And authoritarianism, from Trumpism to Putinism to Orbanism to everything in between, every flavor makes you feel more and more like your choices are being constricted. And so, therefore, the unit of change is often risk. And I am I'm like a pretty risk-averse person, personally. For me, it became a question of like, I don't just wanna profile the most preternaturally courageous people on earth, the Navalny's, the Mandelas, the Malalas of the world, because that's interesting, but it's not gonna be useful to me, and it's not gonna be that useful to most people that I know. The better question is, how do regular people like me take little risks in our own context? If you're working at a law firm and making a bunch of money, and your firm is striking a deal with the administration that you think is wrong, if you're a university professor and your university is entering into sort of a coercive agreement, if you're living in a neighborhood that has lots of immigrants in it, or really anything in between, like, how do you just find some way to dissent, even if it's not standing in front of a tank? And for me, that changed my thinking. And I think that probably moving forward, whatever I do in the future, whatever my political or professional life looks like, I think that I will see calculated risk taking as a tool in my toolbox where I didn't before in any setting. And our book really goes through piece by piece about how people do that in their own lives.
Next month for me will be 4 years since I left MAGA. And when I wrote my mea culpa and renounced my support for MAGA and Trump, I honestly never thought that anybody would care. I figured it would maybe a couple people would read the story, I'd get some comments, and I would close that chapter of my life. But it turned out that people did care, and I had to figure out from all of that what to do next. And so, born from telling my story and recounting it to media organizations, born from all that came Leaving MAGA as an organization. And you mentioned community earlier. That's what we have formed. For me, MAGA was a community. I had a second family. I felt seen and heard and vindicated and respected and appreciated. And walking away from that, there was a personal cost because I was going to walk away from all of these close-knit relationships
Yeah.
that I developed, and I had nowhere to go. But thankfully, I landed on my own 2 feet and was able to create this new community for people who leave. But your article today in the Bulwark advises against that. Could you talk about that piece that you published today?
If your goal is to figure out what works to defeat authoritarianism, and you go out into the world as we did and talk to dissidents on 5 continents, talk to researchers, talk to scholars, talk to activists, opposition leaders, over and over again, you hear shame doesn't work. But in building a movement, the goal of of an anti-authoritarian movement is to sweep as many people into it as possible so that it's undeniable and so that you get people into the streets, but also doing all kinds of other things so that a regime can't stand. But all of them said that one of their regrets or one of the things that they would do differently is to be able to differentiate between the fascists, the authoritarians in power, and their supporters. And one thing that I talk about in the Bulwark piece is something that Natan Sharansky, one of the leaders of the Soviet Jewry movement, says when he talks about convincing people. He says every totalitarian society, I'll say every illiberal society or community, has three kinds of people. There are the true believers, and you know plenty of them, we both do. There are the dissidents, and then there are the double thinkers. And the double thinkers are the people who are having doubts, the people who see that there's something wrong, who are starting to hear that voice I was talking about before, but have not yet decided to take the leap. And so the question is, like, what gets those people? What moves those people to take the leap, to join the opposition, to join the movement? But for most regular people, and this is where we include your work, what really works better is something that we call in the book a lily pad theory. People are not going to jump unless they have something to jump to. If you are going to make everyone renounce everything that they've ever believed in order to change their mind and make a different political decision, it's not going to work. You're going to lose. You can look to the research on this, or you can just look to your own heart on this and understand that anytime anyone has ever said, "I told you so," you've thought, "This is unpleasant and I don't want to be part of this." What I try to be clear in the Bulwark piece, and we're clear in the book. Not every coalition is a good coalition. If you really don't share values, if there are people who continue to believe that some people aren't people or don't deserve the same rights, don't make common cause with them. That's called a toxic coalition, and political scientists have studied it. And, both for moral and practical reasons, it just doesn't work. But what is so powerful to me about leaving MAGA and your work, and what's so powerful to me about Stefania's story, and the story of an Israeli soldier who we put you sort of in conversation with in the book, and several others who we discuss, is we do have tools to allow people to change their minds. Not necessarily, and you write so beautifully about this, not necessarily to persuade people or to convince people, but to give people something to come to, not just something to leave, but something to come to, where they can continue to be their whole selves, where they can be, as all of us are, evolving human beings on a journey, and to be an actual community with each other. That is a political tool that I, as a member of the American progressive movement, really, really implore and advocate my own, sort of political countrymen, if you will, to become much more conversant in, because shame will only get us so far. And you and your colleagues and your work are such a powerful example of that, Rich. And that's why we were so honored to include your story in the book.
Ami, in closing here, let me just say that for anyone who's boycotting Amazon, the book is available at bookstores other than Amazon. So
Yes.
it's in all major bookstores. So if anyone who wants the book but doesn't want to buy it on Amazon, it is available elsewhere. So there's that first point I wanted to mention.
Thank you.
In closing, tell us where we can find you for those who are watching and want to follow up and continue to monitor your work and Julia's work, and where people can find you online.
I'm pretty active on Instagram, at Ami Fields-Meyer. I'm on Blue Sky. I also have a Substack where I write with some consistency. That's called You Are Here. But Instagram is probably the best, sort of most consistent place.
Again, the book is on courage, how to be a dissident in an age of fear, with Ami Fields-Meyer, and he was joined by his co-author, Miss Julia Angwin. I have started the book, Ami. I am So excited to read this, not just the section with Leaving MAGA, but the entire book. I have no doubt that I am going to be inspired by this work, and it's a great honor for us to have been featured in it. And I just want to thank you for writing the book. I want to publicly thank Julia for working for you guys and what you did together, and I appreciate you being here today. It's good to see you.
Thank you, brother. I'm very grateful, and more soon, I hope.
Yeah, same here on behalf of everyone at Leaving MAGA. Thank you so much.